this is how the Solomon sleeper gets cut out. I've cut mine out from scraps because I'm trying to use up scraps, but you can see how it fits together if it were a zero waste cutting plan, if you're doing it that way. The only place where there's a little bit of waste is here, depending on the size, bigger or smaller, this rectangle. Plus there's these little bits that you cut away from the armholes and the back neckline here. If you did want to do the zero waste, you could just take a bigger seam allowance here and leave that, then you don't have to cut it off. So I've cut out all my pieces. We have the back here and the front here. Be sure you do throw away this part. Don't throw away the front neckline because you need that for the gusset. So the back and the front, I've got the two triangles, which are going to become the tops of the sleeves. In this corner, I've got these two pieces, which become the neckband. Here, there's two cuffs. These are the cuffs for the sleeves. And next to them, these are the cuffs for the ankles. Label them somehow. On the cutting plan, they're called wrists and ankles to keep you from mixing them up, because I have mixed them up before, and in some sizes they're even more similarly sized. At the side here, this is the piece which is going to become the plackets. Either we're going to cut it one way or the other, depending on which version we've got, and we've got two sleeve pieces here. So that's all of the cutting done. Let's start sewing. So I've done the first step, sewing the shoulder seams already. You can see they're like this. And the next thing I'm going to do is to cut the opening. I'm making the view A with the line of snaps down the front. And since I'm looking here at the wrong side, I know that if I make the cut here, it's going to be, the opening is going to be on the, let me think, left, right. So the opposite leg, whatever. However, I'm looking at this now. When we turn it right side out, the opening will be on this leg. So what I want to do is to draw a line from the center of the collar to the center here. And let me show you a trick for this. If your ruler isn't big enough, obviously you can take another ruler and like butt it together. That's one way to do it. Or you can also mark the center of the leg and match it here with the center of the collar. And then if you smooth this out, oh, perfect. I know the center is the center of Santa there. And then you can use your ruler. As long as your ruler is aligned up 90 degrees here and touching the center here, you can confidently draw a line, especially if you have a working pen, and then cut it, and it will be in a straight line. So, see, nice straight line there. The other thing I'm going to do to get ready to sew this is to prep my plackets. I've got my long placket piece here. If you're doing the shoulder snaps, you're going to want to trim off a couple of sections here. I'll show that somehow else. But since I'm just doing the long placket, I'm just going to divide this into two sections. You definitely should measure it to be sure that both of them are 6 centimeters wide. Don't eyeball it like I'm doing here. Measuring is your friend. And you definitely should interface it as well. What you're going to want is a 3 centimeter strip of interfacing here, just on one side of it. I'm also not going to be doing that because I don't want to, and I'll tell you why. Here's another version, an older version of this pajamas that I made, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago. I think it was the first version I ever made of this one. But anyway, this is an uninterfaced placket also from a very similar thin jersey fabric. These snaps are uninterfaced and they've survived 3 years. So I'm not going to be adding interfacing to this one either. But that's a judgment call. I'm not telling you what to do. If you want a more durable garment, then you should add interfacing, like the instructions say. Okay, so I've sewn these plackets on, and at the bottom, probably you have extra. It depends on your size how much extra you have. You do need to trim that off. And if you don't want to waste it, I think what I'm going to do on mine is I'm going to turn it into a little patch pocket later. So I'm going to set that aside for later. And what I've also done is I've done the next few steps of the collar, which is that I've marked in my seam allowances here, and then I've sewn this, not so much of a gentle curve, kind of a wonky curve, but the other one worked out nicer maybe. Yeah, I've sewn the curve there, and then I'm going to make just a couple of snips into the seam allowance to help it open up and curve around the collar band. If your fabric is less stretchy, maybe you make a couple more. This fabric is very stretchy, so I think it can curve very well. And I've also taken the two parts of my collar band. Oh, if I'd been paying more attention, I could have rotated it. Whatever, the scrap one. And I sewed them together here. And what I'm going to do is, the instructions say you're supposed to baste the edges together, right? Yes. I'm going to use some pins here. That'll be fine. And at the ends, what we're going to do is to trim it a little bit. Something like this. Just so that the end here is going to end up 1 centimeter wide, or slightly less, like a hair less than 1 centimeter is even better. And then that sort of tapers back to the rest of the neckband. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Oops. If I pressed this well, as it says in the instructions, this step would be easier. Perfect, that's beautiful. Okay. And now, I'm definitely going to baste this like the instructions say. I'm just going to do that off camera so you're not going to see it. Let's pretend I've done that. And then we're going to line up the neckband around the collar here. In this case, the seam matches at the center back. And center back. And then the rest of it curves around here. So the two places that you want to pay attention to are, first of all, here, you can't really see my fold, but you want this to be right at the edge of the fold there. And then in a later step, we're going to fold this back over, and it's going to give us a nice finished inside, nice finished edge on the inside. So that. And then the other part where we're going to be careful is, just put a couple more pins here. Here at the corner. Here where we're sewing this, we're going to want to sew just on the outside, so on this side of this line here. And the same for the other corner and the other edge here. So let me get it sewn, and then I'll show you what it looks like. And here's what the collar looks like after sewing it on. You can see that here at the corners, I didn't stretch this one as much as I should have, and you can see it's a little bit lumpy here. That doesn't bother me, and it's definitely not going to bother my son, so I'm not going to take it out, but that's the reason that you want to try to stretch it around the corners a little bit. If it does bother you, you could go back and either take it out and re-sew it, or you could also make like a little dart here, but again, I don't think it really matters. Here at the end, you can see, I hope you can see, how the point of this is like right on the seam line. And that's important because in the next step, we're going to fold this back and then sew right across this, right on the same seam line again. You can even use a straight stitch for this part, as I've done on this one. Cut off the extra threads, of course. And then we can turn that right side out, and hopefully it makes a nice little point there. Not too terrible. And then after you've done both corners, you're going to press the placket back around on the original seam. Again, on the inside, these should line up. And you can do a nice line of top stitching, starting at the one end, going all the way around the collar. And again, the collar is pressed towards the garment, so when you top stitch here, you're stitching through all of the layers, and then down the other layer of the placket here. So top stitching all around, and then we can move on to the next step. Some of the things that happen off camera, I don't know why my machine suddenly started hating all these fabrics, and it's now like sucked it down into the plate. I think I'm going to have to take the plate off. So, slight pause here. Alright, so I've completed the top stitching. So the top stitching has gone all the way around the collar and then down both sides of the placket here. At this point you could add the snaps, or you can wait till the end. I'll probably wait till the end and then never actually add snaps because I hate snaps, but anyway, you can do it how you like. I also tried to use the scraps to like add a pocket here, which was a disaster. Now I have a hole and a lump in my fabric, so I think later that's going to get a little extra patch or something, but for now, let's continue on. Our next step is going to be sewing up the side seams, and what we want to do there is first we're going to draw in the seam allowances here. If you can see this, I've drawn in this 1 centimeter seam allowance here at the bottom of the arm. This is going to help us later when we put the sleeve in. That's the only step you need to do before sewing the side seams. After that, you're just going to align it like, here's my back. I'm going to line up the front on it, right sides together, and then just sew all the way up the leg, stopping at the point here where I've marked. And after I've done that, we're going to continue on with the sleeves, assembling the sleeves. Firstly, we're going to get out these triangles, and on the smaller one is slightly smaller. On that one, you're going to mark the seam allowance, again 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, and then line them up together. The smaller one is just a few millimeters smaller. If it's more than 2 or 3 millimeters, you can also trim the edges here, but it's not really necessary. The important part is going to be here, 1 centimeter beyond the point. We want to trim this off just so that we don't have this little bit floating around on the insides of the sleeve. And then we're going to start sewing this. If you do have a directional fabric like I do, you want obviously this to be the top of the sleeve. So I'm going to start by sewing this here, and on the opposite one I'm going to join this one here. And then after we've sewn these together, we're going to press them like this towards the gusset. By the way, at the point here you can, oh yes, we can see what a beautiful seam allowance, what a beautiful accurate seam allowance I've taken here, whatever. At the point here you can sew a little bit past it, you can stop right at the point. At this point it doesn't really matter, so whatever you feel like doing is good. And then we're going to press this towards the triangle, and then we're just going to bring this over and sew this together. The only part here is that when you're sewing this, you want to sew a little bit here on the inside, or is it the outside? I'm not sure. This side of the seam allowance, just so that your point is fully enclosed on the right side. So let's sew these up to complete the sleeve. The sleeve will then be a tube. And the other thing you're going to do is to take your wrist cuff. Remember, the wrist cuff is in most sizes the one that's smaller. Actually, in every size it'll be the one that's exactly 8 centimeters wider. Hopefully you've labeled the wrist ones to distinguish them from the ankle ones. And you're going to want to sew that together, joining the small sides, the shorter sides. And when you've done that, like I've already done on this one, you can press the seam open or to either side and turn it like this, wrong sides together, to get the cuff ready for joining here. So now I've sewn these sleeves. This is what I was talking about, that the second seam you sew needs to sort of take in this corner here. This one I've deliberately sewn too small to show you what it looks like. This is an extra small seam allowance here, and you can see that, well, you could see better if I took this extra thread out. You can see that the second seam isn't going over the first, and what that's going to look like is that there's this little bit of raw edge of the triangle which is sticking out here, so you just would have to go back and redo this with a slightly fatter seam allowance. I have to remember to do that later. But now we've got both sleeves done, and you also have 2 sleeve cuffs here. Here's the first and here's the second one. And what I'm going to do is if one side is nicer than the other, of course you can play with which is the right side and the wrong side of this, but in general, we're just going to line up the right side of the cuff, whichever side that is, with the right side of the sleeve. We're going to put it inside, and we want the seam in the cuff to be at the bottom of the sleeve, which is the opposite of where the seam is. So this is going to be the bottom. So, oops, my seam is opening up here. Probably should have pressed it instead of just finger pressing it. That's okay. So I'm going to line up the seam here. And then line it up all around and then sew it in. In different sizes, you may have to stretch the cuff more or less to make it to fit here, especially in the really tiny sizes, like the baby sizes, you have to stretch it a lot. But you should be able to do that. So stretch it, pin it well, and then sew all around to both sleeves. So after sewing the cuffs on, you are going to want to press the cuff towards the sleeve. And we're going to turn our sleeves right side out to get them ready to put into the garment itself. Whoops, so we either did the other way. All right. All right. In the original pattern, I've put this triangle at the top of the sleeve just for aesthetic reasons, I guess. There's really no reason that you can't turn it around to have this at the bottom if you like it like that. Either way, I still haven't fixed this. I have to remember to do that. Okay. So I'm going to put it in like this with the triangle at the top. And let me show you on the garment here. I've done the side seams, and also at the top of the side seams, this is the shoulder part, and here's the top of the side seams. I've gone back and I've traced over the seam allowance with a line of stay stitching here. When I was sewing the side seam, I mentioned that you can stop 1 centimeter before the break, so stopping right at the point there. If you didn't do that, that's fine. Also, you're just going to have to make an extra snip there to snip into that as well. Plus, I'm going to snip into the corners here, right into the corners, although being careful not to cut my stitching. And somewhere I have another one too. Yeah, I'm going to do the same thing on this side. And then we're going to be ready to put the sleeves in. So let's see here. Let's start with this one. We want the garment part to be wrong side out, and we want the sleeve to be right side out. And we need to mark 2 places on the sleeve, the top and the bottom. We can do that by lining this up, and then this is going to be the top, and at the opposite end, that's going to be the bottom. No. And I'm going to, let's see, this is the top. Okay, I'm going to put this in here and just line everything up. I'm lining up the top with the shoulder seam. If I had made a more obvious mark, that would help a lot, but I can see it. And I'm going to put a pin there. And then here at the bottom, I'm going to want the bottom to line up with this point here, which is where the seam is. So I'm going to line that up there. This is my matching, and I want it to line up at the seam allowance here. And then the rest we're just going to sort of stretch around, very similar to the way that we did the collar, except on the collar we wanted to stretch it a little bit, which I forgot to do on mine, but I'm sure you remembered. This one we don't need to stretch because it's a sleeve and it doesn't need to stretch. Yeah, okay. We want to sort of stretch this line of stay stitching out so that it's straight here. These cuts that we made are going to open up a little bit. I'm just going to put in a couple of pins there, not into my thumb, into the fabric. That would be great. On this side too. And then this part, I think I'm not even going to pin this because this lines up. Well, maybe I'm going to pin it just to hold this seam allowance in place while I'm sewing. Yeah, and then I'm going to sew all around here. And when you're sewing, it's going to be much easier to do it with the sleeve on the bottom and the garment on the top here, because here you can see the previous line of stay stitching, and you can make sure that you're staying right outside that on this side here. Okay, I've sewn in both sleeves now, and I've also done the line of reinforcement stitching around the bottom of the arm. which, by the way, the easiest way to do this is when you start sewing here with this part up, sew around, and then when you get back to the beginning here, sew again across this, even a couple of times. If you find these floppy, you can also sew a line like here to sort of hold these points down in place. Yeah. And your sleeve should be finished. You can turn it right side out. And you have two nice sort of sleeves somewhere here. Yes. The bottom of the sleeve should be hopefully nice and smooth like this on the outside. If not, if there's anything sticking out, you might want to go back and take a slightly bigger seam allowance, but this one was successful. So we can move on to the next step, which is going to be the crotch seam here with the gusset, and then depending on which version you're making, you might also be adding the snap placket here. I'm not going to do it on this one, but I will show it on a different one. In any case, for either version, we're going to start with the back here. You can see at both the back and the front, I've traced in the seam allowance, and then I've gone over it with a stay stitch here. I've also drawn in this middle line, and I'm going to make some clips into the corners here. Yeah. And then I'm going to get my gusset, this little cutout from the front neck. We want to mark the middle points here. One there, and one there, and then we'll be sewing this in so that the curvier side, this is going to attach to the back legs, and the front side is going to attach to the front legs or to the snap placket if you're going with snaps there. So let's find the back of this garment. That's here, yes. Flip it over. Here's the back, and we're going to start with right sides together. I'm lining up the center with the center here, and I'm going to stick a pin in there, and then after this part I find it easier to just turn the whole thing over and flatten it out, and then sort of curve this up around like this. And we want, it does not have to match at the cut edge here, but the seam allowance is going to match. I'm going to put in a couple of pins here and here. This fabric is very stretchy, that's going to be good. And don't forget that when you sew, you're going to stop sewing 1 centimeter from the end here. On the other side, I'm going to repeat the process, sort of curving this up and around. And I'll stick one more pin in there. Then I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew this into place. So here's the gusset sewn in. And our next step is going to be to sort of open up this leg here and either sew in the snap placket, or in this version I'm going to sew in the front of the leg, which is somewhere. Yes, this would be here. But before we do that, on either version we need to deal with these little corners here. So what you did, you left this open. Yeah, you stopped sewing 1 centimeter from there. And because you stopped sewing 1 centimeter from there, we can press the seam, or even just finger press it towards the garment away from this gusset. And then at the corner here, this should line up into sort of a nice 45-degree angle, or this one's slightly more because I wasn't so precise with the seam allowance again. The point would be that when we sew our next line, which is going to be here, we're going to sew right on this line here, and we want this to be as smooth as possible. This corner, oh, it's all rolled up. Does definitely not want to go into a nice 45-degree. Oh, no, wait, no, there we go. Now I've lost my pins. That's okay. Yeah, this one I was less precise with the seam allowance even compared to the other one, but that's okay. If it's not perfect, that doesn't matter. The point is, and it's hard to see anyway because of this stupid rolly fabric. I'm so fed up with this fabric. The point is just going to be that your seam allowance is going to follow this line, go right through this point where you finished stitching across and then down the other way. So now we can attach the snap placket. I'll show that in another video or another little clip. But for me, I'm just going to attach the front here, which means again, I'm going to clip here and then line this up, this middle, with the middle of the placket. And then just continue lining this up. Everything should line up perfectly all the way down the legs. And yes. So, and I'm going to sew all the way across from one end of the leg to the other. And I just wanted to show how I'm sewing this, even if we're not making the perfect angle here, just to sew everything and have everything enclosed. Here I have the gusset, and I've just sewn up the leg here. And when I get to this corner here, I'm going to fold this seam back just to check where it is. And now this is sort of making an angle here. After I know where that is, I can fold this back here. And I want to sew just on the inside, or outside, or whatever side it is, just to the left of where the seam is ending here. And that will be the finished gusset. And if the gusset is finished, then the only thing we have left is going to be the ankle cuffs. So first, since I haven't done the snaps yet, I'm just going to pin this one layer over the other. And I have my two cuff pieces, which is the only pieces we have left. And the same like we did the wrist cuffs, I folded them in half and then stitched the short ends together to make a tube, and then turning them right side out, folding them together. And in the same way, we want to sew them whichever the right side of the cuff is. If you have one side which is prettier, we want to match the right side of the cuff with the right side of the pants. And the seam in the cuff is going to be matched here. I'm going to do it like this. If you have, especially in the smaller sizes where you need to gather the pants to match the cuff, it's going to be easier to turn the whole thing inside out, because then the smaller part, the cuff, is going to be on the inside and it'll make it easier to gather. But either way, you want to line up the seam with the inseam, the one that's connecting to the gusset, and we're going to line up the inseam with the seam in the cuff. Stick a pin in there, and another pin on the other side, and then sew all around. On this one, we're going to do the same thing, just being careful. If you don't want to have a pin here, you could also just baste this close, or you could actually install the snaps. That would be an easier way of doing it also. If you're sewing the version with the crotch snaps, it's going to be the same thing, except on both legs you'll have here at the inseam this, and you want to be sure that you have it overlapped the same on both legs, not like one's over and one under, and just pin it in place, and then again put the cuff in and sew all around. And here is the finished sleeper. I finished putting in these cuffs. I actually sewed one in the wrong way. You can see the seam here on this one is correct. It's lined up with the inseam here. On this one, I don't know what I was doing. I lined up the seam with the side seam here. Whatever, doesn't really matter. Although, in theory, you should do both of them the same way so that it's symmetrical, but whatever. And I did manage to put the snaps in. You can see here in the middle, I've used mostly green snaps, but here, this middle one, I did it in a red snap. That way, that's going to be really useful to not mismatch the snaps, buttoning them up in the middle of the night. And I did fix up this little rough spot here with a little patch. So, sleeper is finished. And the other one too, the B view, is finished. Well, it's finished enough to show you the parts that I want to show you, which is that here I've added, safety pins, which could be snaps. And you can see how I've added the cuff here with the seam lined up with this. And at the top, the sleeves don't have the cuffs yet, but the snap placket is more or less finished. So there you go. Those are the Solomon Sleeper. I hope you enjoy sewing yours, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments down below. Thanks for watching! Or alternatively, here's how to do the shoulder snaps if you're doing the shoulder snaps version. On this version, I've sewn the, the right hand shoulder seam, and I've pressed it. And we have this on the left side, we have the open shoulder still, and we're going to use part of the placket to do that. So we're going to take the long piece of placket and from one end trim off, which I've already done, a 3 centimeter section and a 6 centimeter section. And the longer section we can put away for later. We'll use that for the crotch snaps. And what you're going to want to do is to interface these pieces. Like I said before in the other version, I'm not interfacing them because I don't want to. That's it. You definitely should though, for more stability. And what we're going to do is basically sew this part, the short part, onto the front and the bigger part onto the back. On the bigger part, the interface part is going to be here, so the part which is the part which you're sewing now. So, and then after we sew that, we're going to trim off this extra here. And that's going to look like this after we've sewn it. I don't know why my machine absolutely hates this fabric. This is some of the ugliest stitching I have ever seen, but secure at least, so that's what matters. All right, and then we're going to press both of these, or finger press them away from the placket, so towards the garment, and trimming off the extra bits. If you were making a bigger size 122 and up, you are going to have to either stretch this a little bit or else trim this down a little, but that's only for the biggest sizes. Then the next thing we're going to do is to prep the corners of the neckline here, the same way that we did in the previous version. So drawing in the seam allowance and then doing some stay stitching right along the edge here. After you do the stay stitching, do a couple of little clips into the corner. And then we're going to prepare the collar. This is a collar that I actually cut from a previous version, so it does not have the seam in the middle. Normally you take your two collar pieces and you seam them together. And then after doing that, we're going to trim the edges down, if I can find my scissors, so that this edge here is just 1 centimeter, starting about 5 to 7 centimeters back. We're going to trim it sort of like this, maybe even out the curve a little, yeah. And then the same on the other end, starting from the fold, about 1 centimeter in or slightly less, and then just trim it in a curve like that. Okay, and then we're going to line this up around the neck here. What we want to do is lining up the raw edges. This one is going to line up right here at the seam. I'm going to put a pin in there, and then lining up the raw edges all around. At the other end, this part, which you've folded and creased before, we want the end to be right in the crease there. And then the rest of the neckline you're going to sort of evenly distribute around, taking care that at the corners you want to line up your stay stitching there. And after you've sewn the collar all around, we're going to clean up the ends here. On this side, we're going to fold this back and then stitch right over this line again. This seam allowance should be going towards the garment, and hopefully you've sewn it down like that. So sew one, sew more there. On this side, same thing, we're going to fold it back here and sew again right along the same line of stitching. And then when you turn the corners right side out, turning these little facings to the back, you should have a nice corner there, and hopefully this one too. No, see, this one is a failure, but that's okay. I just need to go back because you can see there's like a little bit of the raw edge still sticking out here. So I just have to go back and maybe do, what is that, 3 millimeters? 3 millimeters bigger seam allowance here. I can even feel it. My seam allowance needs to start here so that it's catching the end there and then go in. And having corrected that, now when I turn it outside, right side, it's a much nicer corner there. Yeah, with some stray threads, but that's pretty good. Okay, so that part is more or less finished. The only thing left that we need to do is going to be to give it a good press and then top stitch all around this collar. Oops, I'm gonna press it something like that. Yes, top stitching all around. Be sure that here at the shoulder we're catching the facing here. You want to top stitch about 1.5 centimeters, slightly less than 2 centimeters here, then all the way around the collar, and then here to top stitching this seam here. You should be catching this underneath if you've folded it correctly, unlike what I've done. And then after that, either add the snaps now, overlapping the front part over the back here like this, or if you don't want to add the snaps now, just sort of baste this a little bit so that when you're joining the sleeve later, this is going to be easier. Add a line of basting stitches just here to this part of the shoulder here. Okay, so here on the back, I've already sewn in the gusset, and I've made my nice folds at the corner here. So this is going to be one flat line. The instructions say that you should stay stitched. I've just pinned it here, either way. And now I'm going to be preparing the placket. I'll leave the legs here so you can see them. This is the remainder of my placket. Remember that we cut off the 6 centimeter and 3 centimeter part here, but there's enough left over for the 2 parts, the front and the back. So I'm going to cut this in half into 2 sections of 6 centimeters each. You definitely can measure if you want to. I'm just going to eyeball it. And then at the ironing board, we're going to fold this in half. A little bit more precisely than I've done here, but you're also going to be using a real iron, so there you go. And you can interface this if you want. Again, I'm not going to because, as I said before, I don't really think that interfacing is 100% necessary, especially if you're using snaps, which is designed for jersey fabric or stretch fabric, which I'm going to be, but that's up to you. If you're unsure, go with interfacing. It's never bad if this garment has a little bit of extra strength there. But anyway, so I'm going to not be interfacing that. And then very simply, I'm going to save the other one for later. And this one I'm going to line up all the way across here and sew all the way across. And after sewing, I've sewed this on and I've also top stitched it down, pressed towards the main leg. If there's a little bit of extra, we're going to cut it off. And then we're going to sew the other placket to the other side. Actually, right away now, I can cut off the extra because I know that it's going to be the same amount long. That's going to be useful to know. And on the front, let's see, where's our front? All right, on the front legs here, of course, I've done my stay stitching here, and I'm going to clip into this as well. And then I can find the center of this placket quite easily just by folding it in half. And then, yeah, but we're going to imagine that I've been at the ironing board already, of course, and I've folded this in half with interfacing even. Just imagine that. And I'm going to be attaching it to the front legs here. So this center part is going to match right here at this point. It's easier to pin it even from this side. And then this straightens out nice like that. I'm probably going to pin it a little bit just to be sure everything is lining up nicely. and then sewing across. And of course when I sew here, the same as in the other parts, I'm going to sew just on this side of the line of stitching. And you can see this is what the finish looks like. This is the back part, here's the gusset, this is the front. Both sides have the placket sewn on and top stitched. And if I turn it right side out, oops, this is the back with the gusset. Cool. And when I put the snaps on, I'm going to sort of turn this to the front here and then overlap the placket with the front one overlapping the back one, and then installing a few snaps here. Although probably I won't do that yet. Probably what I'm going to do instead is to just pin this here, or maybe top stitch it, I don't know, and then I'll be ready to install the cuff later.